Thank you so much for joining. I want to thank Mr. Emamian, first of all, for diligently organizing this wonderful lecture series. This has played a great role in bringing people together during these pandemic years. And all these lectures have been wonderful occasions to learn new knowledge and gain new exposure to new ideas. Also, I wanted to thank Dr. Jarrahi and his wife, Ms. Parveen Jarrahi, for generously sponsoring this lecture series. Without his sponsorship, this wouldn't have been possible. I am going to talk about this two-season archaeological fieldwork that I did in Germany in a small village called Wustro near Berlin, Germany. The whole duration of the work was 2 weeks. So we worked 1 week during the summer of 2020 and 1 week during the summer of 2021, just this past August. So this was a very small scale work. I mean, we knew what we were looking for and we found some answers. And I really hope that this talk has enough substance to be your worthwhile, to be worth it of your time. So these three people are the directors of the project. Archaeology is inherently a colonial discipline. It started with colonialism. And the tradition has been that scholars from Western countries like US, Canada, European countries go to Near Eastern countries and collect all the data and information, go back to their institutions in their home countries. And in the past, they also collected artifacts for the museums. This has been the tradition. Dr. Susan Pollack and Reinhard Bernbeck were my advisors in SUNY Binghamton during my PhD program. And these two scholars deeply believed in the practice of decolonizing archaeology and reversing the pattern. So this was the first ever archaeological project in Europe that a person from Iran, the archaeologist from Iran who has a role in the official establishment of the archaeological research, was also a co-director in Europe. Dr. Morteza Hesari is a former head of ICAR, and ICAR stands for Iranian Center for Archaeological Research. So this team was involved in the Varamin Plain project for 3 years, and this was a return trip from Iran to Germany. So it's not like we wanted to reverse the tradition of Westerners going to Near Eastern countries and collecting data and information about archaeological sites. This time, Iranians went to Germany and did archaeological work in Germany and collected data and information. This was a brief intro to the people who were actually running this project. But this project of its own was a very much unique project that's a we could call it a trailblazer. So this is a brief outline of my talk. I am going to briefly describe the history of Germany's policy toward Islam and Muslims. And also I'm going to briefly talk about Germany's war policy toward the Soviet territories and POWs of the Soviet Union territories. I am going to show you some finds from the Wustro camp. And I am going to talk about one of these POWs, a Muslim POW that was kept in Wustro camp, and we know of because of historical records, and his name was Musa Jalil. Musa Jalil is a hero, national hero of Tatarstan. He is a poet. He's a national poet of Tatarstan. By the time Germany was founded, there was nothing much left in the region to be claimed. The territories that became known as the Middle East and had already been divided between Germany's neighbors. During World War I, the main policy was foreign policy of Germany was undermining British and French influences in these territories. So Germans came up with an ingenious idea, as usual. They came up with the idea of invoking jihad among the Muslims to undermine the rivals in Europe. And this idea was first introduced by this guy named Max von Oppenheim. He was a German lawyer, diplomat, and archaeologist, and a spy who worked mainly in Iraq, in the famous site of Nineveh. So actually, when I was an undergrad in the University of Tehran, we would read his work in Nineveh and discoveries he made, and much of the artifacts that were discovered in Nineveh were actually transferred to the Pergamon Museum in Germany, in Berlin. He's also known as the Abu Jihad of Germany. In late October 1914, before the Ottomans had entered the war, siding with the Central Powers in World War I, he designed this master plan, invoking the rebellion in Islamic territories of German enemies. The German emperor confirmed Oppenheim's suggestion to incite Muslims, potentially those in British India and French North Africa and Russian Asia, Muslim Asian countries that were territories of Russia at the time, to do jihad under the leadership of the Ottoman Sultan Caliph. Under the influence of German diplomats, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem issued a fatwa for jihad. During this time, 30,000 German soldiers were fighting in the Ottoman army during World War I. But eventually, the Ottoman Empire, as we all know, collapsed, and this was a great defeat. The execution of the jihad was disappointing to Germans, despite the great amount of energy and funds that they spent on it. On a side note, I just wanted to tell you that this idea of using jihad to undermine the power of the rivals was recycled by the US foreign policy during the 70s and the 80s. And we see here the US president meeting with the Mujahideen leader who were at the time called freedom fighters, but then they mutated into this malignant entity that we are dealing with today called the Taliban. And after World War I, the main focus of Germany was on expanding economic and cultural influences in the Middle East. Iran had great economic ties with Germany, and this is a topic of the whole another lecture, the economic ties of Germany with Iran during the time, specifically during the time of Reza Shah. And this is a frame that is being currently kept in the Saheb Qaranieh Palace. Those of you who have visited the Niavaran complex, the Saheb Qaranieh Palace, this picture with the original frame is being kept there. And the text below the picture says, His Imperial Majesty Reza Shah Pahlavi, Shahanshah of Iran, with the best wishes, Berlin, 12 March 1936. And the signature of Hitler himself. It seems to have been a Nowruz gift to Reza Shah at the time. But it's just interesting to know that how they handled this relationship with the Middle Eastern Muslim countries at the time. From his election in 1933 until World War II, Hitler pursued a secondary Middle East peace policy, but this changed after the war started. He regarded the Middle East as a potential battleground, but never as a field of direct engagement. His racist ideas may have been the driving factor for this policy. So he never considered Middle East or Middle Eastern governments to be worthwhile his effort to actually plan for the war in these territories. Here you see a meeting between the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. His name was Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was a refugee in Berlin at the time, actually. This meeting happened in November 1941. And Hitler is promising to this Grand Mufti here that he's willing to solve the Jewish problem step by step, and it would appeal to, at the proper time, to non-European nations as well. So he will actually take care of the Jewish problem in Europe first, and then he will take care of it in other parts of the world, other territories, specifically here, Palestine, as well. And this is that's when Hitler actually started the war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. It started with an attack on June 21st, 1941. The code name for the attack was Operation Barbarossa. And this map shows actually the direction of different attacks that were made to the Soviet territories. The Nazi government had an aggressive war objective. He wanted to kill large parts of the population, the Jewish Bolsheviks. They wanted to Germanize the other ones, and they wanted to do large-scale eviction. So they came up with this idea of hunger plan. This, you see here, this guy, the Backe, he was a Nazi bureaucrat in the government of Hitler. He's the guy who came up with the hunger plan in May 2nd, 1941. And this was a partially implemented plan developed by Nazi bureaucrats to seize food from Soviet Union and give it to German soldiers and civilians. The plan entailed the genocide by starvation of millions of people following Operation Barbarossa. The premise behind the hunger plan was that Germany was not self-sufficient in food supplies. To sustain the war and keep up domestic morale, it needed food from conquered lands at any cost. The plan created a famine as an act of policy, killing millions of people. For example, by mid-1941, when they have already started their attacks to the Soviet territories, the German minority in Poland received 2,000 calories per day. And some actually scholars calculated the amount of these calories based on the records that have survived from the time. While Polish population received about 700 calories, and Jews in the ghetto received only 184 calories. The Jewish ration supplied only 7.5% of human daily needs, and Polish ration only 26%. I'm not sure if any of you have decided to go on diet ever and count their calories, but imagine living on a 182 calories per day. That's how horrible. I mean, it's just beyond horrible how these people were treated. So it resulted in the death of 4.2 million Soviet citizens, including the Jews that were living in the territories. So their rationale behind this hunger plan was that the war can only be continued if the entire Wehrmacht is the force of the war ministry of the Nazi government, is fed from Russia in the third year of the year of the war. If we take what we need out of the country, there can be no doubt that tens of millions of people will die of starvation. So this was specifically the plan of the Nazi government to kill people out of starvation. And it's also interesting to know that there was confusion and strife among leading Nazis as how to operate in the conquered territories of the Soviet Union. The Foreign Office believed that these needs to be preferably autonomous republics with good contacts to the Nazi Reich. So they actually established this Reich Ministry for the occupied Eastern territories, splitting up these republics' territories into different nations and with partial autonomy. And SS firmly believed that they need to use Islam as a unifying factor across all these nations. Actually, something I wanted to tell you about this Backe guy, I forgot. So after the war ended, he was captured, arrested, and put into trial in the Nuremberg trials in 1947. And he had the illusion that the Americans would want to consult him for solving hunger, their own hunger problems. So he considered himself a hunger expert. And then when he found out that that was not the case, he actually killed himself in his prison cell. This guy was the head of the Reich Ministry for the Eastern Territories, Alfred Rosenberg. He was also arrested and put on trial in the Nuremberg trials in 1947 and actually was hanged to death for committing crime against humanity. The Soviet territories under the East Ministry were consisted of Ostland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Turkestan or Tatarstan, and North Caucasus. This is the map of the territories in the so-called Reich Commissariat, and you see Azerbaijan here, East Turkestan, in Eastern China, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. So most of these countries are Muslim territories and Muslims were living here. More than 5 million Soviet POWs, which half of them actually died during captivity because of brutal Nazi policies. Many of these POWs were Muslims that were captured from all these territories that I just showed you the map. They were kept in horrible situation. Half of them died under captivity. And the Nazi system had many different types of camps. This is a screenshot of the Wikipedia page of different Nazi camps. So you can look it up if you're interested, but there were many different types of camps across Germany, Poland, and everywhere else that actually the Nazis controlled, Austria. There were thousands of these different camps across the continent. This is just a map of the concentration camps, the death camps that were used to kill Jews. But these are not the only type of camps that Nazis had. There were many different types of camps. And the concentration camps were mostly located in Poland, Eastern Europe. This is the location of Wustro, the village of Wustro that we worked at near Berlin. You can see in the larger map. It's located in Europe. And this is its situation relevant to Berlin. It's by a lake called the Ruppiner Sea, and the two larger cities are Neuruppin and Fehrbellin near the Wustro village. And this is a map of the village. It's a tiny village. It's very small. This is the only grocery store. Now I'm good. Kuchenbäcker. We had a hard time finding stuff here to prepare meals. There is a boutique hotel by the lake. It actually had a beautiful view, and this is the school of the village. But this tiny village had two museums. That was very interesting. They had one local museum that I'm going to show you a picture of, and the other one that was more like a state museum, more about the military equipment of the medieval ages, medieval Germany. This is a construction sketch from July 1942, and it says how the camp should have been built. But with the work that we did, we found out that this is not how the camp was built. So this was the plan. This is a blueprint of the Nazis. They wanted the camp to be built like this, but this is not how it was built. And we found out this through our field work. So this camp was built in 1942 for the purpose of retaining Soviet prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war, and training them and turning them into Nazi operators. Became a site where victims of the Nazi oppressive system, in this case individual members of the Red Army, were to be transformed into perpetrators of or accomplices in order to subsequently help administer the territories occupied by the Reich Ministry of the occupied Eastern Territories, and to continue the Nazi murderous policies there. So they brought more educated POWs that they captured from the Soviet territories. They brought them into this camp and they trained them here. They sort of brainwashed them into the Nazi system. They wanted to turn them into Nazis and send them back to those territories so they would become Nazi administrators in those countries because they knew the language of those territories. So this was more like a propaganda education camp for these POWs. And not all of the POWs would be lucky to be brought to Wustro. They only chose the more educated ones. And apparently they had a better life situation in these sorts of camps. You see the aerial pictures, the archival aerial pictures from 1941 to 1945. 1941, there is not much going on here. This is where the camp was. And 1945, you see the camp is already fully built. This is the last year of the World War II. So the construction sketch does not correspond to the reality in 1945. This is not what they followed. And this is interesting why this happened in the Nazi system. By 1953, the camp was not there anymore. We really don't know how it ended. We couldn't reconstruct the destruction phase of the camp, but we have an aerial photo from 1953 that shows some activities going on. There are little buildings here, but we really don't know exactly what. We found some evidence that made us to make some assumptions, but we are not sure about that. And now this area is the local nursery. It has a private owner and it's a beautiful nursery, beautiful plants and vegetables they cultivate there. These were the questions we had from our work. We wanted to see what remains of the camp, how the barracks were built, what was the process of building them, and for what activities were these barracks used. We first started with Barrack F, the functional space. It's marked as a kitchen in the original blueprint that I showed you from 1941. And you see a visible trace of foundation here from west to east. This is a visible trace of foundation wall before the excavation. This goes all the way to the nursery is located here. These are all nursery spaces. This was a parking lot here. So this is the wall that you saw in the former picture. This is going west to east, and we opened two trenches here. Flasche is a German word for trench, or the workshop that we opened in archaeology. These are other trenches. We wanted to see what happened outside of the barrack, what sort of activities we could trace. That's why we opened these trenches. You see the corners of the foundation wall in the Barrack F. That's the long wall that you saw in the first picture. And the other corner, and this is the aerial photograph. This is the same wall from west to east. That's the corner, and that's where we opened some trenches here in this corner too. So we found the lower edge of the foundation wall. It was about 90 centimeter high, so it was pretty sturdy. These guys were here to stay for a long time. They thought this was going to be here for a long time. It only stayed for 4 years. And the width was about 25, 26 centimeter. So these were pretty hefty foundation walls. You see the brick imprints on top of the foundation walls. We didn't find many bricks. We found some sporadic bricks here and there, but it seems that the bricks were recycled in the later period. So people actually took them and used them in other construction projects in the village. So the bricks were recycled later. See, collapsed concrete slabs in the southwest corner of one of the barracks. We really don't know why this happened, but this may be related to the violent end of the camp that I'm going to talk later about. You see a rough paving in front of the entrance to the barrack here. This is flash 11, so this is where you're looking at. This is outside of the barrack here in this trench that we were working in. And we also opened a small trench outside of the barrack. This one, flash 9 here. To see what was happening outside of the barrack, we found this sewage pipe that shows this was probably a toilet or a washroom outside of the barrack. And this button was probably the most significant find we had during the first season, 2020. One of the main questions was that who really built the barracks? The Nazi records say that electricians, architects were brought from the village and near towns to build the barracks, but it's apparently this is not the case. It was the inmates who built the barracks, and that's why, because we found. Anybody can guess what is this button here? See if you have an archaeological instinct. Can you tell? Anybody wants to give me a hint? I would love to hear your ideas.
Star of
The
David.
Star of David?
It's not a Star of David, but close.
Star of
yeah, good. It's a star.
No, it's from Jewish.
It's not from Jewish, no. Yeah, but it's a star. So I give you a hint. This
Star of Bethlehem?
No, it's not. It's not relevant to Jewish people were not in this camp. This had nothing to do with Jewish people. These were the Soviet POWs.
That's a sickle and hammer, is that correct?
Great job, Aghay Emamian. Yes, exactly, yes. So this camp was only used to train prisoners of wars from Soviet Union, and many of these prisoners of war were Muslims. That's what. So yes, Aghay Emamian, good job. This is a sickle, this is a hammer. And this is a star. This is a uniform button of a Red Army officer. So these Red Army officers who were brought here were also responsible for building these barracks. And somebody took the chance to push his uniform, but first of all, bringing his uniform button with him to the camp and pushing it while the concrete was still wet. Why would a person do something like that had a penalty that could be shot in the head at the moment by a Nazi officer very easily? But a person did this to say we were here and we were Red Army officers who built this camp. So this was obviously an act of defiance. It was an expression of subversion that this was actually later evident in the actions of some of the other people trained in this camp that I'm going to talk about, like Musa Jalil. I'm going to talk about the Tatar poet Musa Jalil. Their clandestine actions were discovered eventually, and they were all executed in a prison near Berlin in 1944. But this was interesting that we actually found a material evidence of this act of defiance that these prisoners were expressing. So this made a buzz in the newspapers. The reporters made reports of the Star of Wustro. It was called as a Star of Wustro in German. So this is approximately where it was pushed into the country, in the corner of the foundation wall of the barrack. She's Ms. Maryam Naimi. She's an Iranian student of Frey University in Berlin. That's where actually Dr. Pollack and Dr. Bernbeck teach Frey University in Berlin. She was another Iranian colleague in the project. We also actually worked in the barrack edge that was more removed from the main barrack. It was more hidden behind the bushes and was far away from the main barrack. The functional barrack was close to the Rin, to the little river that was flowing behind the space. And this was used as a toilet wash space for the prisoners. And the oral tradition, older people in the village told us that this was a spot that villagers would come to talk to the people who were kept at the camp. So it's kind of a space for exchange of ideas. And the walls had the same width and length. They were 8 meters in length and they had the same width. You see there were large original concrete slabs that's still recoverable here in this space. And the foundation walls were built with the same method, with molds, with probably wooden molds that they poured concrete in. This was another aerial shot from the site. And now I'm going to talk about material finds, the artifacts that we found in the camp. So we categorized them to 3 different categories. The materials that belonged to the time before the camp was built, material from the time that the training camp was there, and the material from time after the camp was shut down and destroyed probably. This is a smoking pipe that probably belonged to the time before the camp was built. And this is a reconstruction of a similar, the Berlin type of, there's the so-called, they have a specific name, these smoking pipes apparently. We also found many medical equipment in the corner of the functional barrack. So we originally thought maybe this functional barrack was used as a space for medical operations, some kind of medical operations on the prisoners. But we were lucky to find some writings in some of the equipment. And they do not belong to the time of the camp, to the Nazi time that the prisoners were being kept in the camp. They were made by this company, in Leipzig, and they are from 1950s. So the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, probably. And we found many of these medical equipment, the drip bottles and very thin vials. And this is an aerial shot from 1953. Some activities going on here. This is from the time that prisoners were kept here. But then in 1953, some activities going on here, but we're not sure. Probably a doctor's office or something. A local village doctor had an office here in this area after the camp was abandoned after the war. These are the material from the time that camp was being used to keep prisoners in there. We find this stone staff that called Schiefertafel. I don't think there is a English equivalent for the term. These are not used in English countries. They are used for training children, training school children, and the ones with horizontal lines are used for alphabets, and the ones with little squares for doing math, for numbers. And we actually had samples of the slabs that had both, that one side was horizontal lined and the other side had small squares. So being used both for alphabet and math. This confirms the assumption that this camp was used for education, for educating prisoners. And this is the graphite pencil that you write in these Schiefertafels. This is actually the local museum that I mentioned to you. This was an interesting local museum. All the items were donated by the villagers, and it depicted how life was in Wustro during 19th and 20th century. A lot of thousands of items, all donated by the residents of the village. And this is a reconstruction of a school desk, and how you see children were using Schiffertafels as a scrapbook, like a scrapbook to practice writing and math on. Apparently these have been used until the end of 20th century as well, but not anymore. We actually found a large number of these Schiffertafels that were online. They were all over the camp, many of them we found. These are some aluminum plates with holes and stamped with numbers. So maybe we thought maybe they're coming from lockers from the barracks. So these prisoners were actually allowed to have personal items and have lockers, and their numbers were actually attached to their lockers. We had very scarce remains of personal belongings. Buttons were the only things we actually found. These prisoners probably all had the same clothes, the same personal material. So no expression of personal, like individuality was going on in the camp. We also found this, these are the, they belong to game vending machines, tokens that are from game vending machines, and they're probably from Berlin. So they were brought into the camp probably by the officers. This is not something that the prisoners would have had access to. Probably had used them in Berlin or planning to use them in Berlin, but they never got to do. We also found some coins, and this is a 5 pfennig. The date is ineligible, but you see the swastika here. So this is obviously from the Nazi time. It actually reminds me of a memory. So I was responsible for recording artifacts in the site, and this was on my table when I was recording it, and suddenly a big wind blew out of nowhere, and it just was thrown to the tall, wet grass. And Dr. Bernbeck was like, don't worry about it, it's gone, it's lost, we know we found it, don't worry. But I felt so bad. I think I spent 45 minutes in the grass, so finally I found it. So this was registered as an artifact, and this is a 50 Reichspfennig, it's from 1921, so this is from before the war. We also found this cooking and eating material from the functional barrack. So it also proves the assumption that this was probably used as a common cooking, eating area. This is a pot lid and a mug. We also find barbed wire pieces from a fence and padlock. And it's interesting, it's actually one interesting observation was that the word for barbed wire in German is Stacheldraht. Stachel is khar and Draht is sim. And in Farsi, as you all know, we call barbed wire sim khardar. So most probably German contractors brought sim khardar to Iran. The concept of sim khardar, the technology of building sim khardar, because this is a literal translation of the German word. Just like how we use beton for concrete, because the German contractors brought beton to Iran, and that's why we use beton. It's a German word for concrete in Farsi. And some of the records say that parts of the camp were free of barbed wire, but we think that probably all of the area of the camp was barbed wire, because we found these pieces of barbed wire in many different locations of the camp. These are other finds like ceramics and coal for cooking and preparing daily food probably. It's an electrical fuse from the time of the camp for electricity system of the camp. And these are iron remains, mostly nails. This is a bullet casing. We found few of these, and that's probably relevant to the destruction phase of the camp, the final days of the camp. Probably some kind of violence was going on. We are not sure what, but some kind of shooting and violence went on, because these were on the more higher levels of the finds. So they mostly belong to the final days of the camp. These are also some remains of war equipment. They have not been studied yet, so we really don't know what exactly these are, but we think they are related to some kind of war operation that is related to the violence end of the camp. So as a conclusion, this so-called Wustro training camp is a place that symbolizes the crimes of the Nazi system in a special way. It is little known historically, and it's interesting in the memory of the local people. It's not that present. Only the older people knew of it, of the presence of this camp in the village. And that museum that I told you about, they had the chronology of what was happening in the area from medieval ages to now. But this 1941 to 1945, there was a gap. There is silence. So this part of the history is very heavy for the Germans. They really don't like to be encountered with it and talk about it. Most of the time you face this actually censorship in many of these local situations. People do not like to remember the atrocities that happened during World War II. This camp has been a place where people were to be turned into perpetrators and thus complicit, even in a point of participating in the Holocaust. So some of these people were actually being sent back in the Eastern territories in the concentration camps to participate in the Holocaust. To what extent it is historically provable that this camp had successes in the intended transformation of people into criminals is archaeologically inconclusive. Historically, too, not much is known about this camp to date, but archival material provides insight into the diversion from its planning. We know it was not built the way it should have been built, so there was a diversion from the blueprint from the first day. Moreover, it is known that quite a few of the inmates of this camp resisted the indoctrination attempt to the extent that they paid for it with their lives. Archaeologically, the early resistance can be seen, among other things, the uniform button pushed into the wet foundation wall. This should certainly be understood as an act of defiance. The excavation of a bathroom barrack, the barrack edge that I showed you that was to the back of the camp area, is also a visualization of a place where, if we accept the evidence of oral history, the older village people, forbidden information could have been exchanged and plans could have been made. The fate of those held in the camp is also revealed in another sense. In addition to the remnants of barbed wire that we found in 2021, a synopsis of the camp's construction documents and archaeological evidence shows that POWs were put into hardest physical labor. According to one report, more than 2% of the inmates died in 1942 alone, the first year that the training camp existed. From what is not mentioned in the training, in the euphemistic report, work overload along with generally poor physical condition due to hunger and disease may have been major cause for the death of the inmates. So many of these people who actually entered the camp, they died the first few months they were there because of the probably hard physical labor they were put into and the poor health conditions that they were in. And as you all know, northern Germany is really cold. Berlin is cold. They were probably dealing with cold weather over there with not much equipment. And now I'm going to talk about this guy, Musa Jalil. We know that Musa Jalil was one of the inmates in this camp. He's a national hero of Tatarstan. Tatarstan is a republic inside the current, actually, Russian Federation, then the Soviet Union. He was a poet, and I'm going to read a very short excerpt from his biography. Many different biographical books has been written about him, and a film actually has been made out of his life. This is a translation from German, so some sentences may be a little rusty, bear with me. In January 1943, Jalil was brought to the Wustro camp. This camp was unusual. It consisted of two parts, closed and open. The first was the usual prisoner of the camp, Barracks, however, designed only for a few hundred people. So very selective, not everybody had the chance to come to the Wustro camp. In total, about 2,000 prisoners passed through Wustro from the autumn of 1941 to February 1945. Everyone who arrived there was told that they were going to use them for work in their specialty. In fact, the task was set to prepare the administrative and propaganda apparatus for the occupied territories, Eastern territories. The arrivals were first placed in a closed camp strictly on ethnic grounds. So it separated these prisoners of war based on their ethnicity and put them together in one space. They were also driven to work, but in the evenings, classes were held in which the so-called educational leaders probed and selected people. So those Schiefertafels and the graphite pencils that we found actually confirmed this observation that this camp was used for as a training camp, and these guys had evening classes there. The prisoners studied the state structure of the Third Reich, its laws, the program, and the charter of the Nazi Party. German language classes were also held. For the Tatars, lectures were given on the history of the Eid al-Ural, the area that the Tatars come from, and for Muslims, classes about Islam. Those who graduated from the courses were given money, a civil passport, and other documents. They were sent to work on the distribution of the Ministry of the Occupied Eastern Regions. In a closed camp, Jalil and his associates continued their underground opposition to the Nazis. The group included journalist Rahim Sattar, so these were the comrades of Musa Jalil, also other people from Tatarstan. Children's writer Abdullah Alish, engineer Fuad Olatov, economist Garif Shabayev. All of them, for the sake of appearance, agreed to cooperate with the Germans. I'm sorry. Oh. This is the next slide. They continued their underground opposition to the Nazis. The group included journalists. I read these names to you. So there was a group of 5 people. All of them, for the sake of appearance, agreed to cooperate with the Germans. In the words of Musa Jalil, the way he has written, in order to blow up the legend from the inside. Jalil and his comrades were found out to be conspiring against the Nazis. So apparently somebody gave the word to the Nazis that these guys were up to something in the camp, and were arrested and put in prison. In Moabit is a prison that they were put, and then it's a name of the poetry book that Jalil wrote. His cellmate was a Belgian citizen named Andre Timmermans. That's how we have access to the poetry of Musa Jalil. This Andre Timmermans, since he was a Belgian citizen, he was allowed to have newspaper and paper in prison. The Tatars were not allowed to have paper or write anything, letters. They were only allowed to have books with them, to read books. This Belgian guy gave newspapers and scraps of paper that he had to Musa Jalil, and he sewed these scraps of paper into 2 notebooks, and he wrote his poetry on it and gave it, passed it on to Andre Timmermans. When he was released, he went back to Belgium and gave that to the consulate of the Soviet in Belgium. And the consulate gave the books to the family of Musa Jalil, and that's how we have the poetry books now. So he concealed the book as a Turkish-German dictionary. He pretended the poetry book to be Turkish-German dictionary, and he actually hid it in his clothes in prison. On August 25, 1944, Jalil and his comrades were executed in the Plötzensee prison in near Berlin by guillotine. In the column, accusation column in the cards of the convicts, it was written, so their crime was undermining the power of the Reich, helping the enemy. Jalil was executed fifth among the group of 5 people, so he was the last person to be executed, and the time was 12:18 p.m. An hour before the execution, the Germans arranged a meeting between the Tatars and the mullah, so they brought a mullah for these Muslim guys in the prison. The mullah did not find words of consolation, and the Jalilavites did not want to communicate with him, surprisingly. Almost without words, he handed them the Quran, and all of them, putting their hands on the book, said goodbye to life. The Quran was brought to Kazan, and Kazan is the capital city of Tatarstan in the early 1990s, and it's kept in the museum in Kazan right now. Before the execution, Musa gave the note, I told you that he gave the notebook, the poetry notebook, to the Belgian guy, and that's how it's passed to his family, and now it's been. So he's a big figure. Actually, he's a national hero in Tatarstan, and he has been given many prizes. At the beginning, people thought that they were actually collaborating with the Nazis, so they were considered to be traitors. But then posthumously, the truth came out, and they were awarded prizes, and they were recognized as national heroes. And we don't know really what happened to their bodies, but the assumption is dreadful that often the Anatomical Institute took the bodies from the Plötzensee prison in Berlin for scientific studies. So that's where the bodies ended, unfortunately. These are pictures from our daily work. That's me doing the artifact recording. Lisa Azer from Turkey, the Mariam, and our topographer Sebastian. And the photo on the top is from the season 2020 season. The one on the bottom is from 2021. And we had this awesome breakfast with German bread and cheese and awesome vegetable from the nursery, which I miss very much. So I would be very happy to answer any questions you have. This was very brief, and I'm not an expert on the area, in this specific area, but I hope it was worth your while. Thank you so much for listening to me.